for all the reasons I've given. So there we are.
Excellent. Well, on that note, we'll move on to questions. So, any questions from the audience? Yeah?
First of all, apologies for being late. Just picking up on one of your major points in terms of resources. We've got exactly the same. I'm from Spain. I've been here 20 years or so. My Spanish times are way gone.
No, I've got 3 Spanish grandchildren.
Right.
I've also got a Greek granddaughter.
And yes, I think we don't have a government as far as I can tell, but I don't think that's
Well,
anything to do with the EU.
I think it is actually, because it's to do with the austerity, and that has come from the imposition of the requirements under the Maastricht Treaty.
Well, that and the fact that our politicians have been corrupt for many years.
Yeah, but they can become corrupt. I mean, anyway, okay.
And they were corrupt before the European
Yeah, well, they've been corrupt forever, so that's
yeah. But going back to the resources, for me the problem is 2 ways. One is what will happen to all of the British people who are taking advantage of the resources elsewhere, and I can say that as a Spaniard, because our health service is completely overwhelmed by second house buyers, mainly by, you know, elderly,
British.
retired, UK, that's the typical overwhelm, especially on the coast. I mean, smaller,
I've been in Marbella, yeah, I know all that.
Hip replacements for free, who wouldn't? I mean, anyhow, that's the one thing. The other thing is, I'm on the medical sciences here. I shake to think what will happen if Europeans were not covering for the lack of doctors and nurses that we've had in this country for many, many years. It would be disastrous. So, yes, I agree, it is a stray on the resources. I think Britain, being in or out of the EU, won't solve that. Britain will still get immigrants. It was getting immigrants throughout its history before the EU.
Not on this scale.
Plus, now you have with the EU, you have a good way of getting some of that back. I go into other countries and doing exactly the same that other people are doing in your country, which is stretching in the resources as well.
Okay. Well, I mean, basically, I put it this way. In terms of the expatriates, for example, there is going to be a problem if people want to make it into one. It's not necessary. And actually, there are a lot of people, 600,000 French who live in England. I mean, and so it goes on. And I don't think there are that many Spanish by comparison, but there are quite a lot. But there are an awful lot of Czechs. I think it's something like 200,000 Czechs, 1 million Poles, and so it goes on. And so I think there's a reciprocity question here. And if we were to take the issue of the kind of people you're talking about who've moved to Spain for sunshine and all that sort of thing, which is true, is what they've done. They didn't go because they wanted to live in the middle of Barcelona. They went basically on that scale. It's inconceivable that the Spanish would want to create difficulties when the amount of money that they bring with them is all part and parcel of the indigenous wealth creation of.
They'll definitely stop getting their health.
Yeah, but leave the health out of it.
But that's the main thing.
Well, yes, yeah, I know that they take that out, but they put a lot in because they are bringing money in. They are buying. They're part of the consumer element of Spain, and you may be right that there is an impact on the health resources in certain places, but I would argue that it would be a strange result if the Italians, the Greeks, the Spanish, and all the countries which have got sunshine and beaches were to suddenly draw up the bridge because of a limited number of problems on the expatriate health front, when actually the idea that they wouldn't want all the money that Britain is bringing in through its tourists into Spain, Greece, Italy, etc., is just unthinkable. It's a bit like the German car question, which is basically the Germans have got the slightest intention of putting up barriers against us because they make so much of that, the figures I gave on the single market, about 20 billion of of that deficit comes from German cars and trucks, and it's growing. So, look, I don't think you're wrong to raise the question. I just think it's disproportionate to imagine that our leaving the EU would be a disaster. And could I just say something else? You see, Europe is completely incapable of working. It is impossible for it to continue. And there was a moment about 5-7 years ago when I was really strong for renegotiation. And I thought, you know, we can really get down to this. And I've been on these committees, I know the functioning of them. Because I'm chairman, I meet all the national chairmen of all the other parliamentary committees about once a month. So we meet in the presidency capital, this time it's The Hague, and I meet them and we sit down and we discuss and debate. And it gets quite tough sometimes, and I don't like the German idea of a European army and all that stuff, but that's the hard end. But there's a much more fluid discussion that goes on about the pros and the cons. But my clear impression is that for all the talk, they want Britain in, but for their reasons, not for ours. And the irony, if you'll forgive me for a second, is that they say they want our stability, they want our democracy. We have not been a fascist country. We've saved Europe twice, and we are actually quite stable and sane. And we will remain that way, and we have been actually for a very, very long time. And we haven't had dictatorships, and we're very glad that you haven't either now. But that isn't a reason for itself for us to be dumped into the second tier of a two-tier Europe, largely run by Germany. It's just not going to happen, certainly not as far as I'm concerned. It's really big stuff we're talking about here, because the consequences of allowing the progression on the basis of this extremely ineffective package which the Prime Minister has put together, which I criticised very strongly when I cross-examined him yesterday, and rightly so, is that we will be remaining in the same old European Union with all the same problems, and an accumulating 5 presidents' reports, further movements towards a greater domination of the Eurozone by Germany over the Eurozone and thereby the EU, because there's no change in the voting system or the powers of the institutions. I really know what I'm talking about. And the net result is that we will increasingly find ourselves not outvoted, but confronted with deals that are done in these unsmoke-filled rooms by consensus, which represent the fact that if there was a vote, we'd just be seen to be outvoted. We haven't won a single vote when we called one, which was only done, largely speaking, for appearance sake, so they could say we fought against it, we lost. Once in the European Council of Ministers. We just don't win them. And the reason for that is because everybody else gets together. I'm going to give you an example, which is the ports regulation.
Just to let you know, we are running a little bit short
Oh,
on time.
right,
So
okay. So that's one question.
If
Yes.
we could possibly keep it a little bit brief though.
Well done, international politician.
So, do we have any other questions? We're aiming to finish around 15:15, I
Yeah,
think.
okay.
So
I was giving you a tour de raison.
Any other questions from the audience? Otherwise, I'll jump in with a question. Yeah, sure.
If we do vote to leave on the 23rd, what mechanisms do you think will be employed in order to attempt to renege on or reverse or subvert that decision?
Well, basically, the decision that was taken, which I think is pathetic, this is the decision taken by David Cameron in the package, will only come into effect if there is a vote to remain in. If it's a vote to leave, it obviously disappears. But the mechanism that will be employed will be the mechanism they would like to employ is what they call Article 50. But actually, I don't like Article 50. And I maintain that if you have had a referendum to stay in or to leave, and leaving means I wanted to vote against the basis on which we are now in, that includes all the treaties, and it thereby includes Article 50 as well.
Can you clarify what Article 50 is?
Article 50 prescribes that a member state can apply to leave, and if it does so, there is a 2-year period within which negotiations take place, but there's no guarantee that they will be successful, and furthermore, the consent of the European Parliament is required to the outcome, and there is a majority voting system, and you're not actually at the table, so you're pretty much put with a gun at your head and told these are the terms which we're going to present to you. And I just don't think that if you're British people who have saved Europe twice, and I really mean it. I mean, I might be, I started by saying my father was killed in the war. I take it quite seriously. I've written some very tough letters to the papers recently. Mr. Juncker telling us that it's time the Eurosceptics visited the war cemetery, because then they'd realise what it was all about. And I wrote a letter to the Daily Telegraph. And I said, do you really seriously? I said, you're making me very angry, Mr. Juncker. I said, my father is buried in Normandy, and he was 26. He got the Military Cross against the Waffen SS Panzer Division. And it means something to me, because I'm 76 now, and I was 4 years old. And I can remember it. And I am not going to forget. And I'm certainly couldn't give a damn what Mr. Juncker thinks about it. I really couldn't, actually. And when Mr. Obama comes over and he talks about these silent graves, you know, and the Americans, my father fought with the Americans. They didn't fight for this completely undemocratic, unworkable European Union. They fought for freedom in the Western Alliance and for the rest of the world, as well as for their own future, because of the reasons why they had to come in the war, and also our future. It was about our democracy, which is why I decided in 1990 I was going to take this stand against European government, not against Europe. I love Europe, I'm not kidding. I've got 3 Spanish children, I've got a Greek granddaughter, I've got another daughter who's born in France, another one who's married to an Italian, and so it goes on. I'm probably the most European of Europeans. But it doesn't mean to say that I think anything of the European Union. I think it's a nightmare.
So just to follow up on that question, what do you think our options would be if you were to Brexit?
Well, what you do, I mean, I'm speaking now as a constitutional lawyer, and I'm going to put forward my proposal, which I've put to many of my colleagues, and they find it really quite attractive. I wish I had a Attorney General, and I've been a constitutional lawyer, so I'm not trying to pretend that I can invent something out of the will of the wisp, but a perfectly sensible alternative. Okay, we have a no vote, let's suppose we do. I'm not assuming anything at this stage. What I am saying is that you then bring in your European Communities bracket repeal act, bill, not act. And it says, clause 1, the European Communities Act 1972 is hereby repealed, but it's only a bill at that stage. Clause 2 says all the laws hereinto blah blah blah, which have been passed under the auspices of the 1972, that's all the stuff that's filtered through sections 2 and 3, will now, including all the judgments of the European Court, will now be deemed to be decisions and laws that have been passed by the Westminster Parliament in its own right, in its own sovereign right. So what you do is you say, we're not going to disagree with anything at this stage, we're just going to tell you that now we're going to pass a bill which says that everything is now going to be, as it were, intrinsic to the, the word is indigenous, create an indigenous body of law. I like that word. And autochthonous, that might be even better, because it's of your own motion, which is basically to use your own sovereignty to say, look, we're not going to quarrel with any of the laws at this stage, we just want to set out the parameters, and then basically we then get into negotiation. And they will want to negotiate. And I can tell you, because I have these people from all over Europe who I talk to and get on with famously, very well. We're very friendly, we get on very well in these meetings, and many of them will be very anxious for Britain to stay inside, but for their own reasons. And I simply say, well, what is the point in our saying that we will do what you want, and what you really would achieve would be to reduce our value to the EU, which I would describe as stability and democracy and history and tradition and God knows what else, to a point where it becomes so neutralised and emasculated that it wouldn't be much use to you. That's the problem. You can't have it both ways. And if the consequence, for good or for ill, for whether it was deliberate or whether it was accidental, of Germany taking much more power in relation and much more assertiveness, and I don't need to argue this anymore, everyone knows this, in relation to the Eurozone, and then to apply a similar methodology to the situation in relation to the rest of Europe, including the UK, then I think a lot of people would breathe a sigh of relief and say, well, wait a minute, now look, let's be sensible, let's sit round the table, let's actually have a proper discussion. Let's not just walk off in a huff, but sit down, have a really good discussion, discuss your issues about how to come up with something on the medical science front. There was a very interesting intervention by Nicola Blackwood in the European Scrutiny Committee yesterday, in the Liaison Committee yesterday, and she said there's an enormous amount of money that comes from Europe into medical science. Yeah, but it didn't grow on trees, and we make a 8 billion net contribution, and a lot of the countries who are hollering at us to stay in actually don't make any contribution at all. It's a one-way street. Now, I'm not saying that I resent giving the money. What I'm saying is, hang on a minute, we're paying the bills, we're getting a bad deal out of it on the single market, we're being dumped into the second tier of a two-tier Europe, which is largely being sort of influenced and predominated by Germany. What the hell's going on?
About safety, and how much money is it going to cost Britain to renegotiate all these
Nothing.
things? Because presumably you don't want people like me, well, you may have something personal against me, but
No,
you know, young
no,
professionals who bring money
I want you to
into-
stay. And what I'd say to you is this, that
How much
actually,
money will it cost you to keep me here though? Because
Well, I'll
if,
tell you,
if the government starts treating me as a overseas individual, it's not, you know, if I start needing visas to travel here and there.
well, it may be. I mean, I can't answer your personal issues because I don't know.
No, but I mean,
But
this
what
is,
I can
it's
say
not
to
personal,
you
it's
is that,
millions of people.
no, but yeah, but wait a minute. You know, big issues like this turn into historic events of a kind where people have to make very, very big judgments about their own national interests. And for all the reasons I've given to you, people will just have to accommodate the circumstances, but rely on the fact that we are not going to engage in some kind of isolationist, completely negative. It's not British. We're not like that.
I know, but it's going to
But
cost you
we-
money.
Well, it won't, because you see, we've got this amazing opportunity in the rest of the world, and all this nonsense from OECD and IMF, it's all been orchestrated. And we don't believe it, and in fact, it's not in anybody's interest. In China and Japan and America, and they don't need to be a member of the European Union to trade with the European Union. It's the biggest load of rubbish I've ever heard in my life.
No, that I agree with.
So what I'm saying is that we will find our opportunities in that environment, which is as simple as it ever was. Funnily enough, the same John Bright I mentioned, who was one of my forebears, he actually introduced the first ever free trade treaty in 1861. It was called the French Commercial Treaty. Now, these things come and go, and you can adjust and you can be reasonable and sensible. It's not a black and white situation. And in terms of medical science and the rest of it, you know, the growth that we will achieve, demonstrated by the exponential growth in our sales, in our surplus with the rest of the world, from trading with the rest of the world and drawing back on the European, which is what's been going on because of the losses we made there, will be the basis for this, what I believe to be certainly a steady, if not an explosive growth in our trading relations with the rest of the world. India, I'll give you an example. I was told the other day, and I'm not going to give away too much, I think this is being recorded. But actually, I was told by, let me call him a very important negotiator, that when he was talking to the negotiators on the other side of the table in India, that they said there were real problems with negotiating with the European Union. And everyone in the rest of Europe tends to say, you know, because the European Commission runs the trade policy, and then there's the TTIP, that's, you know, the transatlantic partnership.
Just to build on that, so what are your thoughts on the European Economic Area versus maybe alternative alliances such as the Commonwealth?
Yes, I actually think that was spontaneous. Look, we have the same language, the same laws, basically speaking, same democratic tradition. We actually also have the same commercial deals on the whole. You know, we understand one another in a way that's quite difficult with some other parts of the world. And I don't really see that as a difficult. I think the Anglosphere, as it's called, is quite a productive area. And by the way, they want to trade with us. The idea that you're supplicants when you've got 60-odd million people and you're the 5th largest economy in the world, and when you actually find that many of the Japanese car makers actually want to come here, not because we're in the European Union, but because of all kinds of other advantages, language, also the quality, the training. I mean, there are so many reasons why they want to come over here.
Okay, yeah.
I have a brief question, just picking up on your point about the India negotiation. As far as I know, they're about trade on services, and the UK market for services is already pretty open. So what I'm wondering is, I know that negotiating with Europe must be a pain, but at the same time, the European Union also has a lot to offer. It's a very attractive market for India, and it can offer a lot in terms of services, while having to strike this kind of deal with the United Kingdom will probably, this is just my guess, but it might mean that the United Kingdom has to offer something in goods rather than service market.
Maybe.
Which means less tariffs and less anti-dumping duties, revenues, and less all other kind of protectionist measures actually in place.
Well, I don't believe that there were going to be drawbridge tariffs put up anywhere. It just doesn't make sense. The WTO is, what is it, 2.5% or something, you know, I mean, so what? And basically, we will expand the markets in the rest of the world. We have very good working relations with many countries. I'm chairman of several countries in Africa, chairman of the committee, all-party committee, and also Malaysia. You know, I see huge opportunities there for them and for us, and I think it will continue. And I think our traditions and our way of life will be important. I think Obama was wrong on so many counts, and I think there are many, many people in America, and after all, you know, they want to trade with us too.
But what I'm wondering is, doesn't that mean that your deficit will come from other countries rather than the European Union? Because at the end of the day, if you want to keep prices low, and you don't want to just put all the impact of leaving Europe on the consumers, you're going to have to
But I don't think it's
import
going. I
more.
don't think it's going to be an imposition on them. These are figures which are being calculated by the Treasury. It's a complete and total figment of their imagination. They are engaged in a policy. We're making a decision about something bigger than that. It's not going to be the kind of horror stories that the Project Fear is generating. You know, I mean, I just know it's not going to be like that. I don't even give it second thought. It's a concoction of an attempt to create fear, like they did in the Scottish referendum, and I think it's pretty despicable, actually. But people, funnily enough, are not taken in by it. I said there were movements in the waters going on, and do you know something? We've had similar situations in the past. Over the euro, everything was going to go wrong. I mean, the euro is going to be the biggest bonanza of all time. And I remember the battles I had over the exchange rate mechanism. It was phenomenal. People used to get up in the House of Commons and walk out when I walked in to a room. I was against the ERM, and it nearly destroyed the British economy. And did the Germans help us? You must be joking. You know, and did we want the German help? I certainly didn't. I just want to get out of the damn thing. And it's the same with the euro and the CBI and all these doommongers and the rest of them. They were all completely wrong. City of London was going to implode. There were going to be puffs of black smoke from Cheapside. You know, it's just not going to happen. You know, we are a mature, extremely sensible, very, very stable country. We've got some problems, but basically we can resolve those, and we're only going to resolve them. And some of them come from excessive immigration, not real immigration, not just immigration. And all I can say to you is that I think these problems are all soluble. Oh, I haven't mentioned defence. NATO, not Europe. Okay.
On that note, we will probably have to finish soon, so if anyone has a final question they'd like to ask, then now would be the time to ask it.
Just a couple of really quick points. You mentioned trade deficit, so between Britain and the EU. First on the Germany point, in fact, they have a trade surplus.
Yeah.
If you compare that to their trade surplus with the rest of the world as well,
Yeah.
as a percentage, it's very advantageous to them as well.
Yes,
So
that is completely true. Their trade surplus with the rest of the world runs at about, I think it's 88 billion, and it's about the same with Europe as well. They're more or less the same.
as a percentage of total trade, it's far in excess with the rest of the world. The point with the trade deficit, and I get annoyed, I'm for Remain, but I get annoyed when Remain campaigns say that there's a trade surplus for the EU because it's not true. But I think that the point we should make is the fact that when it does come down to a negotiation with the European Union, and this is part of the point about the power of the European Union's collective market, what the European Union has to play with is 44% of our total exports as a collective.
That's true.
While we just have 12% to play with. And so that will give them a huge, huge advantage in negotiation. And what I would agree very much with you that we should not just take this argument saying, well, it's economically inviable, therefore we should give up our principles because we just cannot leave on economic grounds. I agree with you, but it has to be taken into consideration.
Yeah, I'm not saying it isn't, and I did mention it was 44% myself. But what I am saying to you is that if you run even a large element like that, and then you run it at a deficit, it is obviously not working as well for you as it is for Germany. It's as simple as that. And there are reasons for that, and I described that in my book in 1990, and I say what will happen is this new voting system will turn on the foreign direct investment by Germany in the countries in their immediate vicinity and elsewhere, as a result of which they will get increasing control over the economies of those countries because the countries will be dependent on Germany. The money on the cheap labour will go back into Germany, it will make them richer and richer, and it will be handing Germany, and these are my very words, handing Germany legitimate power on a plate. And that is what's happened. But I'm not saying that you're wrong to argue the case with respect to the amount of trade, but it's just not going to go away. We will continue to trade, and by the way, look at the City of London. We've allowed ourselves, I wrote a paper or a letter to the paper, the Financial Times, 7 years ago, and I said, or 10 years ago, and I said, don't go down the de la Rosière report route. It's now banking union, banking regulation, the whole thing. And the bottom line is there have been 5 instances where we've taken matters to the European Court, and we've lost every single one, and we've been losing even our costs.
Okay, so we have maybe one last question here. Maybe we should possibly have a time after it you can come up.
Well,
and
do you want to
speak
stay here
to
till
us
2 o'clock in the
afterwards.
morning?
Yeah, but I think we'll have to finish with that. So maybe one last question, and then we'll finish.
Yeah, I just wondered why this constant comparison is made between the international organisation, which is the EU and its trade, and individual countries, which on average in Europe have a 73% surplus in trade with Britain. And the idea that comparing the whole of the EU with Britain's trade, it just is an astonishing one and an irrelevant one when each country in Europe has an enormous surplus, and in an election year for Germany and France, putting at risk at least 1 million jobs in Europe by putting up tariffs or whatever seems a highly self-damaging act.
It's just not going to happen.
A very strange one.
And by the way, the other thing on the same sort of theme was the fact that opening the doors and tearing up the Dublin regulation to all the immigrants however much one might sympathise with some of the really tragic cases that refugees have experienced, the bottom line is that on that scale, which was done very significantly for German economic interests because of their declining population, because they wanted to have, and watch this space. My guess is that they will cherry pick all the best people who have come in, who have got high qualifications, and then the rest will find that they're not getting the jobs, and they will end up in other countries. Germany doesn't do anything which is not in its own national interest, and I'm beginning to think it's called economic nationalism.
Which the gastarbeiter are an example of.
Yeah, well there you are.
On that interesting note, we'd like to thank Sir Cash for coming to speak here today. We've had an excellent discussion. I'm sure you'll all agree with me. It's been very informative. So enjoy the